Cool. So there is something that I would dare say every one of us is experiencing to a certain extent. I felt compelled within myself to try and find some sort of way of getting a better understanding for what it was that I was experiencing, and more so what I was finding other people were experiencing as well. And I think that there's something extremely empowering about finding a way to sort of name something rather than the mystery that can cause for the solution itself to seem pretty elusive. As such, I simply called it social atrophy. We all know what social is. It's the act of engaging with one or more other people. And we should, to some extent, know what atrophy is, which is basically the weakening of any sort of muscle. Now, imagine, if you will, that you are an avid runner. Because I think that when you are able to describe things as a simplified analogy, it takes these sort of complex ideals and makes them more practical and more attainable. That being said, imagine you are an avid runner. The kind of avid runner that spends over $260 on sneakers because they're running sneakers, even though you know you could run in any pair of sneakers you'd be wearing, especially if you were in danger. Now, you're the kind of runner that has specific running outfits that you wear, and you're the kind of runner that wakes up ridiculously early, 5:30 in the morning early, to go running. That's who you are at this point in your life. You didn't get there instantly. You got there through a sort of progression. You at one point in time decided that running was going to be an extracurricular sport. Basically, running and swimming is something we do to keep from dying, but some people choose to do it recreationally. More power to them. Now, you run consistently 3 times a week, preferably 5 times a week, if the weather permits. You run the same routes because there's a sense of consistency, and also because you realize that by the end, by the time you return from your origin, you would have ran 5 miles. Oh yes. You're that kind of runner. Now, you know the route, but unfortunately there has been some construction and some debris has found its way into your path. And on a particularly unfortunate morning, through no fault of your own, you stumbled over a piece of debris. And it was bad. It was really bad. So much so that you had to make a phone call. You had to be picked up, both literally and by a vehicle, transported to your house, only to then prepare yourself to go to the hospital. Because it's that bad. It's so bad that you have found yourself with a cast surrounded around half of your leg for 2 months, just for it to recover. Now, the cast has been removed, but what you have found has occurred is a simple scientific term: atrophy. Your muscle has shrunk. The rest of your body has had to compensate for this limb that's become unusable. And slowly but surely you find yourself in a quandary because you are having to undergo physical therapy just to be able to do the regular things that you were doing before in your life, just to be able to move forward and back, to go grocery shopping. Now, over a period of time, 2 years since you first fell that unfortunate morning, you are at the point where you are running again, but you do not run alone. There are a number of reasons why you don't run alone. You don't run alone, 1, because you appreciate, value, and at this point need the support of running with a group. 2, because should anything occur, you have people there beside you to help. And 3, because subconsciously, whether you're aware of it or not, you don't feel confident enough to run with other people being nearby you. That is a simple analogy I think that a lot of us could understand, whether we are that avid of a runner or cyclist or swimmer, whatever the hobby may be. The reason why I give that sort of analogy is because someone was doing something they do on a regular basis, and something came along that they did not expect, and it caused for them to incur a lot of personal damage, externally, physically, internally, emotionally. and it has taken 2 years for them to get to the point where they would feel even remotely comfortable attempting to do that again. If any of you can see where I'm going with this, in March 2020, or whenever the COVID clock might have started for you, something came along while you were going about your day on a regular basis that you were not expecting, that you were not prepared for, and it has to some extent brought damage into your life. This has happened to some extent, but to all of us, not to our leg, but to our social life. We found ourselves engaging with people exponentially less than ever before. We found ourselves talking a lot less to each other. For many of us, it has grown to the extent where there is actual fear associated in just the idea of opening our door and heading out into society among strangers. We don't have a physical therapist in regards to the analogy of the runner, and there are still sort of negative stigmas associated with emotional or psychological therapy. So in other words, unlike this runner who realized the importance and the priority of running in groups and finding support, many of us are either electing to do this entirely on our own or simply choosing not to delve into it at all, to just grow content with the post-COVID social life that we might currently have. So I am trying to present to you this concept of social atrophy, not simply just to give a name to something that we're all experiencing, but also to take some of the experiences that myself and those that I've asked have sort of culminated together, and to see to what extent any of this information, any of this advice, any of this perspective might offer new insight or perhaps new enthusiasm for you to conquer your own social atrophy. You see, many of us experienced the quarantine in different ways, different levels, and to different extents. Some of us no longer work in an office. Some of us don't work at all. Students missed out on opportunities to make friends in class. Some of them are still taking online courses currently. People in support groups for Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and other forms of support groups, they, for years, lost their sense of community, their support structure, which was fundamental to their recovery. People have found that their faith has waned because their ability to attend church ordinarily twice a week dwindled to perhaps twice a year for 2021 and going into this year of 2022. Attendance has waned, and so a lot of these establishments, however large they may be, have found that from a financial standpoint, they haven't been able to sustain themselves. Those are options that are eliminated for others. These are just some of the hurdles people have faced, people who actually want, who will prioritize the idea of community and camaraderie. Some of us have physically lost our friends, our family. Others simply feel as though we've lost people, the people we care for, because our calls go unanswered and our messages are unresponded. Perhaps just slightly worse than them being gone is feeling as though they're gone and knowing they're alive and breathing, but something is inhibiting either us or them from reaching out. So we find ourselves in a quandary from something we didn't expect and something we don't necessarily know even now how to navigate through, this concept of social atrophy. We have found ourselves, whether instinctively or counterintuitively, becoming a little bit more reclusive. And sadly, companies, while so many companies might have suffered, might have closed, perhaps indefinitely, if not permanently, other companies have boomed in business, sadly, because they have exploited this opportunity. There are people who financially gain, who find it quite lucrative for people like you and I to distance ourselves. It's sad, but unfortunately, it is the basis of economy to reinvent. So these modern conveniences are actually anything but. It's making everything harder for us. It's making it harder for us to find new jobs, new relationships, new friendships, because those seemingly simple tasks have become so daunting. For instance, asking a friend to grab lunch for you and meet up with you to eat it with you. Who does that? But it is commonplace to use one of many apps and contract a stranger at a fee to deliver your food. It can be extremely stressful to return from a long flight and ask anyone that you know and care for to pick you up from the airport. But for anywhere from $30 to $50, a complete stranger will do it. These are just a few of the businesses that flourish as a result of what I consider an epidemic to be social atrophy. Now, how do we combat this? What do we do? Especially when we know that there are forces that would prefer that we don't necessarily connect. Well, the way that we combat this first is by being transparent and being vulnerable. You see, let me put it another way that we all understand. We've all had some sort of hurricane or storm, and it is not uncommon, it is not awkward at all once the storm has passed for us to grab our phones, reach out and say, do you have power? Is there debris on your road? Do you have a way in? Do you have a way out? Do you have any damage? Do you need somewhere to stay? Well, if you see COVID, quarantine, and the isolation that came from it as just a hurricane that came on all of our front porches, it makes it a little bit easier for us to feel comfortable saying, how are you dealing with all of this? How's your home? How's your family? When you take an approach that you are already comfortable with, it makes it seem a little bit more achievable. Now, being honest, being transparent, and being vulnerable, the best way to get people to be honest and transparent and vulnerable with you is to start conversations as such. Hey, been having a hard time getting through it, still trying to figure things out. How are things with you? You see, sadly, because of social media and even Zoom, right? We are all these convenient, tailored rectangles. We control what people see. Social media is the same. But if I did a 360 view, you would see that there's unfolded laundry. You would see that there's boxes that have been unpacked, not put away. But what you see here is clear and clean. Knowing that the rest of the world and our own lives are not like that. If we communicate in a way that conveys our understanding that while we might put on a performance for people we don't know, we need to draw the curtain for people that we do know and care about. Because if we sit as an audience member, we have no idea the work that's being done backstage. Another great way to recover from social atrophy is to make small steps to increase your interactions. You see, we're mistaking transactions for interactions. In other words, a vast majority of the people that you might communicate with face-to-face or over the phone, there's business involved, there's commerce involved. You are purchasing something from them, or they are selling something to you, or you're selling something to them. Now, if you mistake interactions for transactions, that leads you to think that you are more socially engaged. But then ask yourself, how many people do you communicate with on a regular basis where there was no purchase, service, or exchange of goods involved? You want to change the quota from that, and you want to make sure that the interactions that you're having are more personal, more vulnerable, and more meaningful. The third way to combat social atrophy, I know I'm over time, but this is so important to me, is to avoid a false sense of inclusion. Now, I know I've thrown a lot of terms out to you, but avoid a false sense of inclusion. I mentioned that a little bit, but let me elaborate just a tad. False sense of inclusion is as such. Well, I'm sure they're perfectly fine. Their most recent Facebook post or the most recent photo they posted on Instagram, they were smiling, they were happy, they look good. Well, when you say things like, oh, I spoke to them last week, but you haven't heard their voice in months. When you said, I talked to them, and you never spoke to them, that bastardization of relationships gives us what I call a false sense of inclusion. You don't feel compelled to actively ask what's going on or how they're feeling, because you feel as though, based on the tidbits of tailored information and data that you're getting, that that is a sufficient amount of inclusion and understanding for what's going on in their life. That is just a costume. That is a performance. That is just a stage. And when the show ends, the screen turns off and the lights dim, that is the person you know and care for. So this is a lot to throw at all of you, but I genuinely care for your health and your well-being, and I do feel that COVID will become a distant memory, but sadly the effects of isolation and social atrophy will take years, if not decades, for us to truly, truly claim conquering and reducing.